Thank you, Aaron. Now, gender-critical civil servants have reportedly been compared to Nazis. So members of a group of civil servants who believe biological sex is binary and immutable say they've witnessed or experienced bullying, harassment or discrimination because of their views. Now, the Telegraph reports some have even been accused of holding views that resemble Nazism. Now, this comes after civil servants warned the Cabinet Secretary of a woke takeover of Whitehall, with gender ideology promoted by trans activists becoming ingrained. So, is Whitehall being held hostage by those who, well, refuse to accept that some people have gender-critical views and believe sex is immutable and binary? Let's speak to Chief Political Commentator at The Independent, John Rentoul. John, thank you very much for coming on to discuss this. I think it's a very important report here, actually, because sometimes stories like this can seem overblown, they can seem exaggerated. But looking at what Stephen Edgington, I believe it is, who's written this story up, has found is actually quite shocking. I think it is indisputable, really, when looking at some of the facts in this report, that those with gender-critical views, well, it's becoming a bit of a hostile environment in Whitehall.
Well, I'm not sure about that. It's rather hard to tell from the report. I mean, the main impression I took away from it is that civil servants don't seem to have enough to do. They seem to spend all their time in Zoom meetings, being rude to each other about their views on sex and gender, which I wouldn't have thought was central to their job. And I think that senior civil servants ought to get a grip of the situation and get them to do some work.
Concerning that there are civil servants who feel bullied, harassed, treated differently for holding views that probably, don't have the statistics to hand, probably the majority of the country would agree with. Could that not have a negative impact on policy making and also make it quite difficult for potentially the Women's Inequality Minister, for example, to put in policy? Or because gender-critical beliefs are actually protected in law under the Equality Act.
Yeah, well, why are we even getting into what's protected by law? I mean, why can't adults in a workplace have a reasonable discussion about controversial issues without descending into calling each other Nazis, which incidentally automatically loses you the argument, or invoking the law? This is completely over the top and unnecessary. People ought to be able to have a reasonable discussion about such things without tending to these extremes.
And I think that's idealistic now. It's simply not the case. It's not just in Whitehall, but across industries. So in the music world, in the arts world, in schools, in big corporates. It is pretty difficult to have these views or to express them when it should be something that is just, okay, we tolerate each other's beliefs. We don't go around calling them Nazis, as you say, but that doesn't seem to be the case. People do seem to be extremely intolerant.
Well, some people do seem to be, yes, and they shouldn't be. So, but the solution, but there's some kind of conspiracy against people holding perfectly normal views about sex and gender, I think is not right. I don't think that is generally the case in British society. I don't think it's generally the case in the civil service. Right.
Well, you've had a number of academics being essentially turfed out of university events, being deplatformed, feeling like they have to leave a university even because their gender-critical views, which essentially is the belief that biological sex is immutable and binary, simply isn't accepted in those institutions. So how do we, and this is, I'm just asking your opinion, how do you think that we can move forward as a society and accept that people have different views on this and people don't need to, not everyone needs to agree, and that's okay?
No, but that's exactly what I'm saying, Emily. I think if more people understood that and appreciated that and respected each other in these debates, then I think we would get a lot further on. The idea. Yes, there are specific problems in some specific institutions, and academia is a terrible place in many ways because the stakes are so small, as Henry Kissinger once said. But generally, I do think that this problem has probably been exaggerated by some elements of the conservative press.
I think it doesn't help that it's quite confusing with some of our politicians what they think on this matter. And it would be helpful to get a clear idea on whose rights, where the rights are, because it seems so confusing. We're going to be talking about schools and socially transitioning children and all of that, and the law around that and the advice and the guidance has either been non-existent or very vague and contradictory. But we'll speak about that later. Thank you very much. Always lovely to speak to you. John Rentoul there, Chief Political Commentator at The Independent. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Rakib, on this, it's a difficult one because John sort of played it down a bit there and said, essentially, can't everyone just get along and accept that people have difference of opinions? But that's not really how it plays out.
No, I think that if I'm being honest, I think John is trivialising the impact of radical transgenderism in many of our public institutions, including within the civil service. I think I'm very uncomfortable with how all too often, if people come across a view which runs counter to their own, they look to strike parallels with Nazi Germany. I've seen that tendency over the course of the last few years, and I think it's incredibly unhelpful and deeply insulting. Biological sex matters. That's the truth of it. And I think that if you have radical transgenderism playing a part within the civil service, I think that's hugely problematic. And I think that we're going to be talking about it a bit later on in terms of, what's going on in some of our schools. I think that there are compromises to be struck here. I think that trans people, they should be able to live their lives free of harassment, intimidation and violence. We have to be very clear here that biological sex matters. And I think that when we go further down the line, we talk about the integrity of same-sex spaces, whether it's rape crisis centres, domestic violence sanctuaries, public toilets and changing rooms. I think that the integrity of those same-sex spaces needs to be preserved and protected.
Yeah, because if civil servants, Joe, aren't willing to tolerate difference of opinion on this issue, how can they work on policy that
I'm sure
dictates that sex-based spaces are required?
I'm sure there are lots of people who work in the civil service who are perfectly able to divorce what their beliefs are, whether they're religious or ethical or whatever, from the job that they are required to do. I think, as I recall, this article in The Telegraph talks about 40 civil servants who've written to Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary. I think there are probably 40,000 civil servants, and that's just a guess.
Well, hang on. Actually, there's a survey that's been done of 305 people civil servants who belong to this group called Sex Equality and Equity Network in the civil service. And they're across 64 departments, and it found that 41% of females who responded and 30% of male respondents said they'd witnessed or experienced bullying, harassment or discrimination for holding gender-critical views, or for not believing in gender identity.
But Emily, it is a tiny, tiny number of people across the entire civil service. So, in terms of journalism, this is absolute cobblers, frankly, that the Telegraph, which once was an esteemed paper, should talk about, the woke brigade taking over Whitehall. This is based on such a tiny number of people across the whole civil service.
Well, Joe, I think
which doesn't mean that
you're dismissing. If this was something else, you're dismissing the experience of these civil servants who are saying that they feel they're in a hostile environment.
At all. I'm not dismissing it at all. What I'm dismissing is the way that it is portrayed, and I think that's the point that John Rentoul was making, that all the time it is whipped up into a thing that people don't read.
No, but these are real issues, though, aren't they?
They are real issues, and they should be debated in a very sensible and very grown-up way, not whipped into some sort of
problem.
Or looking to strike parallels with Nazi Germany, which is also very unhelpful.
Absolutely, no, I completely agree with that. But if you build this up into absolute hysteria based on a survey that's carried out across 300
Joe, I
people,
only think that there is what you call hysteria because there's been so much pressure from the other side, Rakib, to the desire to make everyone conform to one way of thinking.
Well, no,
so it starts with putting your pronouns in your bios.
Well,
we had departments previously, encouraging people to do so. It's also in the corporate world. It does create an environment where if you don't believe that sex and gender are different, or that you can transition,
Okay.
and all of this stuff.
So
that is protected in the Equality Act, Ricky, that you shouldn't, that you can't express your view. I think you can't dismiss.
you can't dismiss it. They're very real concerns, and many people will be in a work environment where they feel uncomfortable and unhappy, as will people of ethnic minorities, of different faith groups. Women have perpetually been marginalised and bullied. There's nothing new in this. There is always going to be, in a large group of people, particularly the workforce, people who feel uncomfortable about the way things are changing.
This is something that transcends Whitehall, though. It's everyone.
I'd also make the point, if we're talking about ethnic and religious minorities who tend to be more socially conservative than the mainstream, I suspect that gender-critical views are disproportionately represented within those groups as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting
Well, absolutely.
point.
So which then, where does that put that? If your faith declares that
Basically,
But I'm just making the point, if you want to have a truly
quickly,
inclusive civil service, which is truly representative of racial and religious minorities, having this kind of attitude towards gender-critical views actually works against that.
yeah, it probably does, but we'll come back to this. We've got lots more coming up on today's show. Republicans stage